Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. On the program, we return to our All Things Africa edition, our journey across the continent and looking at the history and current affairs of each nation. We now explore the African country of Central, some would argue Western Africa, and that is the country of Equatorial Guinea. And who better to teach us about this country or any African country than our returning champion, the brilliant historian, journalist, and activist Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan African Newswire and also frequent contributor to Black Agenda Report, who will be our guide on this trip to Equatorial Guinea's history and current affairs. And folks, and we also, if time is going to be on our side, stay with us because we also will do a breaking news current affairs episode about what's happening with the horrendous attack terrorism that Israel has just inflicted on Iran. So join us for that. But before that, we will be focused on Equatorial Guinea. So Abayomi, first off, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you so much for your ongoing interest and coverage of developments on the African continent. It's very, very important during this time period.
Exactly. Well, and as always, it's always an honor and a privilege to have you on as our history teacher. So all my thanks and appreciation for the time you give us. And as always, folks, please donate generously, not just to Pan-African Newswire and Black Agenda Report, but please donate generously if you can to One Plus One. Share all of our content, past and present, and help us overcome the far-right algorithms and help us overcome the monopoly that Western corporate media and Western state media has in the social media world by sharing all of One Plus One's content and, again, donating to us. And now to the topic at hand. So, Abayomi, as always, tell us, what was Equatorial Guinea like before Spanish colonization? Then how did it become a Spanish colony, and what were the conditions of the people under Spanish colonization?
Well, like many other African countries, the lines that were drawn during the period of enslavement and colonialism are not representative of what existed during the pre-slavery and pre-colonial era. And that is definitely true of Equatorial Guinea, or what became Equatorial Guinea. Initially, it was named the Spanish Guinea and the Spanish Gulf of Guinea. And of course, the question of the Atlantic slave trade is always important. It was the Portuguese, for example, who made contact with the people of that country during the 1470s. When we talk about Equatorial Guinea, we mainly focus on the offshore island of Bioko and also the inland territory as well. So this country encompasses both inland territory in the central western region of Africa, as well as the island of Bioko, which is out in the Atlantic Ocean. And being in this location, of course, it made it quite vulnerable to the advent of the Atlantic slave trade and later colonialism. But of course, the people have a culture, a history, and a civilization that goes back, some estimates indicate some 4,000 years. And the people, the majority of the people in that territory are from the Fang ethnic group, that's F-A-N-G, and they constitute about 85% of the population of Equatorial Guinea. Then there's the Bubi people, who constitute a smaller proportion of the population, but still the second largest ethnic group in what today is considered Equatorial Guinea. The country was known, of course, as a result of its artwork, the amazing heads and other forms of artwork that were done in wood as well as rocks. And these pieces of art still today remain in European museums across the continent, as well as other parts of the world. So just like in various parts of Africa, the artwork that was produced by the people over centuries was stolen during the period of enslavement and colonialism. So this is very, very important for us to understand, and that the Atlantic slave trade had a devastating impact on the peoples, the Fang peoples, and the Bubi peoples of Equatorial Guinea. Many people died as a result of European imported diseases, such as whooping cough. There was huge problems with tuberculosis in later years, and other diseases as well. So a lot of people died as a result of the Atlantic slave trade and the subsequent diseases that were brought by the colonialists. Their artwork was stolen, and of course, they were virtually enslaved by the Spanish, eventually the Spanish, who imposed forced labor and other types of exploitation of the people in that territory. So many people died that eventually they were forced to import Africans from other territories on the continent as laborers. Lots of people came from Liberia, from Sierra Leone, and other areas of West Africa to work on the plantations that were established by the Spanish during the period of the 15th century all the way up to the 20th century. So the country has undergone enormous exploitation and oppression.
Unbelievable, unbelievable, and quite shocking. This is Equatorial Guinea is unique in the research. I was doing on in the research I was doing and preparing for the show. It's one of the
Yes.
few African countries that was actually colonized by Spain, and whereas the Spanish Empire had relinquished its control over much of Latin America, what we call Latin America, and Central America, Mexico and so forth. And yet, Spain Spain had this African colony, which was only given independence, I believe, in 1968, which means that Equatorial Guinea was ruled not just by a brutal Spanish, conquistadors, but it was also ruled by a Spain that was under a fascist dictatorship of Francisco Franco. So talk to us. Talk to us a bit about that, and talk to us about how Equatorial Guinea became independent, and was it a peaceful transition or one of violent struggle?
Well, it was one of violent struggle, and this struggle went on for centuries. In fact, on the island, Bioko Island, it was known largely as a death trap for Europeans. Not only the diseases, but also there was tremendous resistance on the part of the indigenous people against the Portuguese, the Spanish, and also the British. The British were involved in terms of competition with Spain for control of that area. And they were also involved in terms of managing some of the plantations that existed on Bioko Island. A lot of people, as I mentioned before, were enslaved, and a lot of them died from diseases brought in by the Europeans, and also for the over excessive work commitments that were imposed on them by the colonial forces under slavery, as well as classical colonialism. So this was a huge blow to the African continent. The country today only has a population of approximately 1.7 million people. You can only speculate the degree to which the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism had on the population growth in that area. As I mentioned before, so many people died in the process. Others fled during the period of enslavement and colonialism. So the colonialists brought in workers from other parts of Africa, and even from the Western Hemisphere, because Spain controlled a lot of territories in North America, Central America, the Caribbean, as well as South America. So there was a process of importing people from Cuba and other areas in Latin America to work in the Spanish Guinea territory. So it has a mix of ethnic backgrounds, people who come from various geopolitical regions in Africa, as well as Latin America. There was the involvement of the British, the Spanish, and the Portuguese in the entire process of colonialization and exploitation of the people. They developed the cash crops of coffee and cocoa. It was largely cultivated through very harsh labor conditions. This was exported to Western imperialist countries. And as a result of that, the lords, the landlords, and the colonial administrators made a considerable amount of money for the Spanish government and later for the British government as well. So the Atlantic slave trade had an extremely negative impact on the population there. And this, of course, had a lot to do with the post-colonial period and how it went after 1968. But there was a transitional period largely between around 1959 and 1968. But it was very, very difficult, the whole process. You had, as I mentioned, the Portuguese, you had the Spaniards, people were brought in from Cuba as well to work in the fields. The Creole people, who largely were centered in West Africa, were also recruited, captured, and brought to Equatorial Guinea to work in the plantations. So the country had a very bitter and very difficult history after the onslaught of the Portuguese in the 15th century and later Spain, which eventually took control of these territories.
Actually, just before we talk about Equatorial Guinea when it became an independent country and the two dictators that ruled over it, so I want to understand something. But yeah, so I want to understand this because I think this might shock a lot of our listeners and our viewers. So we all acknowledge that colonialism was horrific for the colonial subjects, but the kinds of but those kinds of horrific practices that colonialists that colonialists engage, like the forced labor, the and the brutal conditions of that still was continuing in Equatorial Guinea even during the post-colonial period, where so many countries in Africa were were given their independence or fought for their independence, but that kind of awful human rights abuses, systemic human rights abuses that comes with colonialism, that was still going on in Equatorial Guinea under Franco before they achieved their independence in 1968.
Yeah, it worsened because the Spanish Civil War between 1936 and 1939 impacted that part of Africa as well.
Okay.
Some forces there remained loyal to the Republican Spanish government, while others sided with Franco and the fascists, the dictatorial fascists. The Civil War went on for 3 years, but what was interesting about the whole process is that once the fascists took dominance over the whole colonial structures, the conditions of the African workers worsened during that particular time period. So that's important to acknowledge that the situation actually worsened during the period of the Spanish Civil War.
Unbelievable. That's yeah, no, that's quite unbelievable. And it reminds me of how Hong Kong. So during during the period where Britain gave independence to its African countries, its Caribbean subjects, and stuff like that. And while all that was going on, Hong Kong remained a British a British colony. And even though workers in Britain were given some form of workers' rights, the allowed to strike, the allowed the right of collective bargaining, Hong Kong was not given that, and when they did, demand that, they were often brutally suppressed. So when I think of Spain and its ongoing colonization of Equatorial Guinea, it reminds me of that. And so,
yeah, well, even in Britain itself, the workers had to fight just for fundamental rights, and that's how you had the development of the workers' movement, the communist organizations, socialist organizations, and of course, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels were part of the Communist League, which was founded in Britain. And they wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1947, 1948. But if you read their writings, the conditions were horrible for workers in Britain during that particular time period. Engels wrote a book I think it was published in 1844 entitled "The Conditions of Working People in England." And
yeah,
all you have to
brilliant
do
book.
is read that book and see the horrible conditions that working people faced in Britain during the 19th century. Even in the United States, it was horrendous. You talk about the steel industry, the coal industry, the fight for an 8-hour day in the United States. So even in the Western imperialist countries, conditions were bad, even for the European and white workers as well. But they were far worse for people in Africa and other parts of the world. In Equatorial Guinea, they had forced labor. People were brought in from other African states. They attempted to sever any connections between the Fang and the Bubi people of the island off the coast of West Africa, drawing divisions between the territory on the continental western coast and those of the islands out in the Atlantic Ocean. So all of this was done during this particular time period. Now, I wanted to mention that in 1778, there was a treaty that was signed between Spain and King Charles of Spain, and was signed with the Portuguese. And that, of course, turned over full control of the island and the territory known as the Bight of Biafra, which is a area in the Atlantic Ocean. And this existed between the Niger and the Ogi rivers. This was ceded to Spain in exchange for large swaths of South America. So they swapped territories between Africa and South America. And some of the territory is now considered Western Brazil, which was given up by the Spanish to the Portuguese during that particular time period. Between 1778 and 1810, of course, the British were transitioning from their reliance on enslavement to colonialism, which is really another form of slavery, but just a more efficient form of labor exploitation and division. And of course, they attempted to suppress the involvement in the importation, the capturing, importation, and exporting of Africans for the purpose of enslavement. But it was a difficult, very difficult situation, because we know slavery continued in countries that were colonized by Spain and later by Portugal, all the way up until the end of the 19th century.
Yeah.
You know, in Cuba, for example, slavery didn't end until the late 1880s. Same situation in Brazil. And Brazil broke away from Portuguese rule, but it was done under a monarchy.
Yes,
and,
exactly.
It was an anti-monarchical uprising in the late 1880s that actually brought about the dissolution of slavery in Brazil. So we have slavery that existed even longer than what took place in the United States, where slavery officially ended in 1865. But in Cuba and Brazil, you know, the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, slavery didn't end until 2.5 decades later. So all of this is very, very important to understand. People think that sometimes the enslavement and colonization enacted by Spain was somehow more benevolent than the British and the French and the Portuguese. But if you look at the actual history, it's really not the case at all. So these are just some of the important developments, historical developments that took place in the 18th and the 19th century. Between 1844 and 1900, Britain returned totally the control of the island of Biorko back to Spain. That's located, of course, off the coast of the continent. Many people died during this particular time period from yellow fever outbreaks, and the plantations were largely run as work stations by the Europeans. And as we said before, people suffered immensely during this particular time period. There was a Spanish explorer named Marvel Iridin. He lived between 1854 and 1911, and he was instrumental in penetrating some of the territories in Equatorial Guinea in the interior. And he went around and found all these places, claiming he had signed treaties with the indigenous groups there, and consequently turning over the territory to Spain. There's no real evidence that any negotiations took place. These areas were fingered, by this explorer, and then, of course, deemed to be a part of Spanish Guinea. So these are some of the developments that took place during this particular time period. And as I mentioned, during the Spanish Civil War, the situation worsened. After the Spanish Civil War, there was some discussion about liberalizing the colonial system, bringing about a transition to independence. And this is what happened during the late 1950s and the first few years of the 1960s. There were political parties that were formed during that particular time period, but the conditions remained pretty dire for the African people in the former Spanish Guinea.
Wow. Now, talk to us about Equatorial Guinea's early years as an independent country, and talk to us about the legacy of its first leader, and unfortunately, its first dictator. And forgive me, folks, if I butcher his name, Francesco Macias Nguema. Is that how you say it?
Yes.
Yes.
And
So talk to us about it.
he was the first leader of independent Equatorial Guinea, and his reign was marked by tremendous repression and even mass executions of the African people. A lot of the people that were killed were the people who were not part of the Fang ethnic group, but many of his own ethnic group were also slaughtered during that process. And of course, Macias eventually in 1979 was overthrown by the current leader of Equatorial Guinea, who was said to have been his nephew.
Yes, and actually, but before we get into that, okay, so you already mentioned that he was a very repressive leader, but however, was there any good in the legacy he left behind? Because reading about him on Wikipedia, it seems he was a very unmerciful dictator. Some compared him to Pol Pot in his backwardness, ruthless suppression of opponents, deeply tribalistic, sectarian, even to the point of genocidal. And yet, reading about the political party he hailed from, the United National Workers' Party, its ideology, according to Wikipedia, was anti-colonialism, Pan-Africanism, African socialism, but also totalitarianism and anti-intellectualism. So did Equatorial Guinea get to experience any positives under his leadership, or is it one mostly of just totalitarianism and anti-intellectualism?
Well, what happened during the post-colonial period is that they discovered oil inside of Equatorial Guinea. And the exploration by the oil corporations raised the national income of the country. It's considered one of the wealthier countries on the African continent. Nonetheless, the distribution of the wealth is highly unequal and disproportionate. So we have to keep that in mind. Even though they have oil, even though they have national wealth, the wealth is not distributed equally among the people. So that's very, very important for us to understand. And the oil exploration in Equatorial Guinea has been a source of involvement by the West, and also being attacked, by the West too, as being dictatorial and other forms of misrule inside the country. But there were other leaders too in the anti-colonial movement, and one of them, K.O. Mani, was killed. In fact, in 1959, under very mysterious circumstances. Many people believe he was killed by Spain and some of their collaborators. And then we talked about the 1979 coup, the later execution of the first leader by Teodoro Obiang, who is the current leader right now. He took over in 1979. But I mentioned Mobile Oil has been involved in the country over the last 50 years, and they have been involved in extracting oil from Equatorial Guinea. And there's a tremendous amount of money that's been flowing into the country, but nevertheless, it has not improved the overall conditions of the masses inside the country. You've got a very wealthy elite there, but the people are still suffering immensely.
Unbelievable. And yes, as you mentioned, Nguema was overthrown in the military coup led by and replaced by his own nephew, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mambozo. Sorry if I'm butchering his name. Who actually put his uncle on trial for many crimes against humanity, and he was executed. And he has ruled the nation since 1982. And like Cameroon, which we covered, I believe, last week.
Yes.
I believe last week has governed. And like Cameroon, who has been governed under the leadership and presidency of Paul Biya, he has not broken away from the repressive nature of his uncle's regime. And whereas his uncle's United National Workers Party on paper was supposed to have all these positive ideologies that
sounds good. The name sounds good, right?
Exactly. And even though on paper they have all the positive ideologies that should unite and advance a deeply impoverished African country, unfortunately, the Democratic Party of Equatorial Guinea, which is in power right now, has been in power since the 70s, is fairly right wing and right leaning, and I would even say that that's too polite. I would say that they're fairly far right, and with economic liberalism and progressive liberalism at its core, and it's even a member of the it's even a member of the centrist Democrat International, which is where Christian Democrat parties and other right-leaning parties meet to see how they can help one another out and advance a pretty right-wing agenda globally. And in Equatorial Guinea, the ruling party has pursued a massive privatization agenda. So that being said, how do you assess his socioeconomic policies and his ongoing legacy from the 80s to the 90s to the present moment in Equatorial Guinea?
Well, it doesn't appear to be moving towards any type of democratic transition. There's still poverty inside the country. And as a result of that, it doesn't appear as if the country is moving forward. Nonetheless, they have been attacked by the Western imperialist countries, and largely due to allegations involving corruption and also political repression. But who is the West, for example, to criticize the government in Equatorial Guinea when this country itself has the largest per capita prison population than any other nation in the world? Huge gaps between those who are wealthy and those who are poor. And there's been a lot of racial turmoil, ethnic disorder in the United States, and it has worsened over the last decade due to the advent of the MAGA Republican movement, Donald Trump, etc. So we have to keep in mind that even though these countries have a lot lacking in terms of democratic practice, social transformation, the attacks that are coming against them from the right wing in the Western imperialist countries, it has to be viewed objectively, meaning that
Yes.
they're not concerned really about the plight of the masses of the people in Equatorial Guinea or any other country in Africa. They're only concerned about the resources and also the geostrategic dominance of those areas. And that's what's really important when we look at the situation inside of Equatorial Guinea.
Exactly, and that's a very, very important point you've emphasized. I wasn't going to mention this, but I'll just mention this briefly before I get to question number 6. Is that yes, Equatorial Guinea is ruled by a very far right regime. One could argue Congo under Mobutu, pretty far right and and very right leaning, and then even Nigeria, which has had multiple far right military juntas, but yeah, and as leftists, we should be denouncing those regimes, and we should be mobilizing with our leftist brothers and sisters in the non-binary in those countries to advance a socialist agenda. But all that being said, as you mentioned, we do have to be very careful when certain Western NGOs, which get funded by our capitalist overlords, when they start to talk about, oh, we need to be looking into this country, and oh, we should even oust such and such a dictator. Because imperialism, it doesn't matter. You could be the most far right regime that does the West bidding. When the Western imperialists decide to do away with you and replace it with another thing, we as leftists, the respect for sovereignty is just as important as workers of the world unite, and we should never ever be cannon fodder when Western imperialists say, now's the time to oust such and such such and such a regime. And that's a perfect segue actually to this question I wanted to ask, which is, what was Equatorial Guinea's place in the Cold War? I read under Francesco Nguema, he actually developed a close rapport with the Eastern Bloc nations and the USSR, and even Cuba and North Korea. And so can you talk to us about that and EG's relations with the collective West during the Cold War, after the Cold War, and the present moment where we see attempts to build a multipolar world, and with the rise and ongoing attempts to sabotage BRICS, all of this under the leadership of Teodoro Nguema Magaboso. I'm curious. I'm curious your response to that.
Yeah, the USSR and the Comecon countries did go out of their way to develop relationships with various African states. During the colonial period, of course, they championed the national liberation movements, those who had taken up arms, and also those who were doing it through nonviolent mass mobilizations and organizational activities. Cuba, of course, in terms of its Spanish heritage in regard to colonialism, that would bring about some basis for equitable relationships. Also, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of Cubans, many of whom were of African descent, were brought to Equatorial Guinea to work during the colonial period, quite interestingly enough. A lot of other people also came from Cameroon, Nigeria, and Liberia. We're talking about tens of thousands of people, because he had a demand for labor due to the fact that many people were sickened by the European imported diseases. Many people died as a result of the brutality carried out by Portugal, Spain, the British plantation overlords, and a lot of people suffered, a lot of people died, a lot of people fled from the horrendous conditions that existed on the Bioko Island, and also in Muni, which is the continental base of Equatorial Guinea. So yes, not surprising that the fact that they speak Spanish, one of the few countries in Africa that have a Spanish as a national language. And this, of course, would provide a basis for relations with Cuba and other countries throughout Latin America. They share DNA with the Africans in Equatorial Guinea. So it's a very interesting process. Even though we had slavery, people taking enslaved Africans from the continent to Latin America, there was a reverse migration as well. In the case of Equatorial Guinea, where people who were needed for labor were exported from Latin America back to Africa for the purpose of working on the cocoa and coffee plantations in West Africa.
Fascinating. And how is Equatorial? Well, you've talked a bit already about Equatorial Guinea's relations with other African countries, but talk a bit more about that. And does it play a positive role in African affairs or a reactionary one, where it's doing the bidding of Western imperialism, Western capitalism?
I think largely they try to remain focused on developments inside their own country, but they are members of the African Union. Also, about 20 years ago, there was what appeared to be an attempted coup in Equatorial Guinea. This took place around 2004, where even the former British Prime Minister's son, the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, her son was allegedly involved in this attempted coup.
Mark Thatcher. What is Mark Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher's son, Mark.
Yes, right.
Wow. Okay, and, interesting.
They sent mercenaries. They stopped over in Zimbabwe, and I guess the Zimbabwe military security forces detected that something was wrong. And they searched these people, interrogated them, and found out they were actually on a mission to go to Equatorial Guinea to depose the government that is in power right now. So that was, it was stopped. The people were arrested. They were supposed to have been in prison, but there was some agreement that was worked out where they were actually exported and deported, out of the country. So that was a very, very interesting development that took place. I believe it was in 2004, where you had British nationals, which had mobilized mercenaries to go to the Equatorial Guinea, to the capital of Malabo, and actually carry out a coup d'etat against the current government that exists there. But it did not work. And I have not heard about any other serious attempts to overthrow the government in Equatorial Guinea.
Why do you think the West would try to overthrow a government which is very far right and does the bidding of multinational Western corporations, particularly of the fossil fuel industry? I'm curious your response.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It could be they want to take full control of the exploration and export of oil from that country. They may want more of a, quote, multi-party bourgeois democratic electoral system, unquote, in Equatorial Guinea. In many cases, it doesn't matter. They have moved against their allies in the past. So it's not surprising that they would do this again. We've seen it. If these people become liabilities, as far as they're concerned, in terms of being an embarrassment or perhaps not willing to follow the dictates categorically of the Western imperialist countries, yes, they will move against people and attempt to overthrow them. We have numerous examples of this in Africa and other parts of the world. Look at the situation of Manuel Noriega.
Great example.
Now, he had been a CIA informant and all that, but when he refused to go along with their program in regard to developments taking place in other Latin American countries, particularly Nicaragua, he became persona non grata. And under George Bush Sr., they sent troops to overthrow the government in Panama and to imprison Noriega. And they've done it in other instances as well. During the first Gulf War, remember, they sent troops to Saudi Arabia after Iraq moved into Kuwait. But during the Iraq-Iran War, interestingly enough, they were involved in arming the Iraqi government of Saddam Hussein. They also sent weapons to the Iranians as well in exchange
the Iran-Contra scandal.
in exchange for the release of hostages and later for other issues. So the imperialists, in some cases, they will support both sides if they think it is in their interest to do so.
Yeah, unbelievable.
Yes,
it's crazy.
it is.
So yeah, no, it's crazy, and in fact, that's actually a perfect segue then to this question, which is, how do you assess the opposition in Equatorial Guinea? Is there a large left-wing opposition, or even a broad, strong left-wing movement that, if the conditions are ripe and ready, and it's ready to take power and address the plight of its mostly poor majority, many again in grotesque, destitute poverty, which no nation with its resources, no nation at all, regardless of what its economy is blessed with, people shouldn't have to live under such unacceptable conditions. So I'm curious, talk to us about if there is a left-wing opposition in Equatorial Guinea, or is the opposition aligned with a faction of Western imperialism?
Well, I think that any opposition, particularly left-wing opposition in Equatorial Guinea, would keep a very, very low profile during this period because historically, any opposition forces inside the country have been arrested, possibly forced to flee, imprisoned, and maybe even executed. So at this stage, the prospects for some type of left-wing movement or overthrow of the government does not seem probable or plausible or possible. Now, things may change. You know, I mean, there may be elements there that are working underground to bring about fundamental change. We've seen it in other countries, neighboring Gabon, for example, where you also have members of the Fang ethnic group. We saw what happened there 2 years ago, where the Bongo family, after serving approximately 50 years in power, were overthrown. But there hasn't been a drastic shift in domestic or foreign policy in Gabon. There was some indications that they may ask the French troops to leave, but they have not fundamentally shifted their ideological orientation. And in fact, the recent elections that were held inside the country brought about the ascendancy of a former military leader who took off his military fatigues and put on civilian clothes and ran for office and became president of Gabon. We'll have to see what happens there as well. So we don't know in terms of Equatorial Guinea what may happen. There's always potential for unrest in various African countries, but considering the repressive atmosphere that has prevailed there since 1968, it's very difficult to judge the potential for fundamental change, even minor change in regard to overthrowing the current administration and installing another administration, a military regime, or perhaps some type of multi-party democratic system. But beginning with the early, Macias in his days, people even described him as a Hitler because all the people that were killed under his administration, particularly during the 1970s, after 1972, where they literally wiped out a lot of the opposition parties and also organizations that were attempting to build some type of democratic system in Equatorial Guinea. And that so terrified the population that even people within his own ranks rose up and overthrew Macias Nguema, and he, of course, was executed by the current leader of the country. in Equatorial Guinea right now.
Crazy. And this is my last question.
Mhm.
Yes, yes. This is my last question. Any final thoughts on Equatorial Guinea then, and what's the best way forward in advancing, I would hope socialism and true democracy in Equatorial Guinea? And before you answer that question, let me just read out this. It's shocking that according to Wikipedia, these are some general facts about the nation. Since the mid 1990s, Equatorial Guinea has become one of sub-Saharan Africa's largest oil producers. It has subsequently become the richest country per capita in Africa. However, the wealth is extremely unevenly distributed, with few people benefiting from the oil riches. The country ranks 133rd on the 2023 Human Development Index, with less than half the population having access to clean drinking water and 7.9% of children dying before the age of 5. Since Equatorial Guinea is a former Spanish colony, Spain is the main official language. French, as of 2010, Portuguese has also been made official. But it's the only country in Africa where Spain is an official language. Equatorial Guinea's government is, according to Wikipedia, authoritarian and sultanist, and has one of the worst human rights records in the world, consistently ranking among the worst of the worst. In Freedom House's annual survey of political and civil rights, and Reporters Without Borders ranks Obiang among its predators of press freedom and human trafficking. We talked a lot about Equatorial Guinea and slavery, Equatorial Guinea and the grotesque forced labor that comes with colonialism. Human trafficking is a significant problem, with the U.S. Trafficking in Persons Report identifying Equatorial Guinea as a source and destination country for forced labor and sex trafficking. So yes, so Abayomi, given all of that, how does this country advance socialism and true democracy given such repression and whatnot?
Exactly. And this is in line with these centuries-long systems of enslavement and colonialism. I mentioned that there was a huge importation of people from other African states, even from Latin America, who were subjected to forced labor. So it's continuing this same process that developed during colonialism and prior to that, during the period of enslavement. You had mass rape of African women in Equatorial Guinea, on Bioko Island, as well as the mainland of Rio Muni. So this is a tradition, horrendous tradition that has gone on now for centuries. You even had a mixed race grouping, so-called Creoles, who were involved in the management of the colonial system during the 18th and 19th centuries. So this has been going on for many, many years. In order to break that, there needs to be a revolutionary movement, a movement towards socialism, to reverse the whole process that has been taking place there since the 15th century.
Yeah, unbelievable. But here's hoping that Equatorial Guinea, as we see with this African Spring against French colonialism, here's hoping that happens in
Exactly.
Equatorial Guinea as well as the rest of the continent.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention too,
Yeah,
that Equatorial Guinea is one of the countries mentioned by the President of the United States, Donald Trump, in regard to his travel ban. And
interesting.
The government there couldn't believe it. Neither could the government of the Republic of Congo Brazzaville believe it as well. They're thinking, like, what do we do to deserve having our people banned from travel into the United States? And the only thing the State Department had to say, or Homeland Security, was, well, they overstay their visas. Now, the Equatorial Guinean government said that it was irrelevant as far as they were concerned in terms of the travel ban, because only like 50 people last year traveled from Equatorial Guinea into the United States. But in doing stuff like that, it does target the country for possible further destabilization. Same situation with the Republic of Congo, Brazzaville, which also was hit with a travel ban as well. A lot of the countries that he's targeted are on the African continent. Libya, he mentioned. Sudan is another one. So it's obvious that Trump's foreign policy is heavily racist. They do not want people of African descent inside the United States. And neither do they want people of Latin American descent inside the United States. We see what's going on out in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Where they sent in federalized National Guard troops to guard detention facilities in the downtown area. So the masses will not go out and protest and block the buses and armored vehicles that are bringing in migrants that are being rounded up illegally by the Trump administration. Now they say they're deploying the Marines into the country as well in preparation for further demonstrations that are taking place in LA. Tomorrow in the United States, there's the so-called military parade.
Yes.
Tomorrow is considered Flag Day in the United States. Trump wanted to have a huge military parade, and it's also his birthday. But in response to that, many groups are calling for No King's Day.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a demonstration against the policies of the Trump administration. There's going to be one here in Detroit. They're going to be in hundreds of cities across the United States. So yes, banning people from Equatorial Guinea and Republic of Congo, Libya, Chad, Sudan makes no sense in a realistic way. But it is a reflection of the racism that characterizes the Trump's domestic as well as foreign policy.
And very much also a very incoherent policy, given that these are actually allies of the U.S. that have more or less, see no evil, hear no evil when it comes to what America does, on the African continent, apart from maybe disagreeing with with NATO's actions in Libya. But there you go. That is the Trump administration for you.
Look at Canada, right on the border with the U.S., and they said they want to make it a 51st state. And there's so much anti-U.S. sentiment now in Canada, even in Ontario. Very few people are crossing the border. Used to be constant crossing from both sides. There was a bus. It's still there. The Windsor Tunnel bus that connects Detroit and Windsor, Ontario. I heard that the bus is going to be eliminated at the end of the summer. So people that want to go to Canada from Detroit, for example, would probably have to take a taxi cab, which is $70 US just to cross the border. It's not even a mile distance across the Detroit River between Detroit and Windsor. And they're doing all kinds of stuff to discourage people from traveling between the two countries. So inevitably, there's going to be an economic impact of all of this. We already see it as we speak, and it's going to get worse with the imposition of tariffs and travel bans and the domestic crackdown on people from various ethnic groups and migrants here in the United States. It's going to be a place where a lot of people do not want to travel here and do not want to do business with the United States. So he's actually destroying the country from within, which is what has happened in other empires historically. If you look at ancient Rome, ancient Greece, even Britain, for example, right now shows similar signs of internal deterioration and destruction. We see what's going on in Birmingham, the second largest municipality in the UK. They've had a sanitation workers strike since March. There are thousands upon thousands of tons of garbage that are lined up in the streets, rats, cockroaches, all kinds of vermin that are running the streets now in Birmingham, England. So the imperialist countries themselves are at a point where they are beginning to self-destruct. And it's up to the working people and oppressed people throughout the world to unite, to organize, and to mobilize so they won't be crushed by the internal implosion of these imperialist states.
I couldn't agree with you more, and that's a perfect place to end. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1, our All Things Africa edition, learning about the history and current affairs of Equatorial Guinea, with our always wonderful returning champion, historian, journalist, and Pan-Africanist leftist, and all-around anti-imperialist and supporter of all people power, Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire and Black Agenda Report. Check out his work and all of his appearances on 1+1. Subscribe to Pan-African Newswire and BAR, Black Agenda Report. Donate generously to them. And don't forget to do the same for 1+1. Donate to us, please, and share all of 1+1's content and encourage others to like us. And again, share and donate. The next country we'll be exploring is Sao Tome. Join us next week for that. Have a great weekend, folks. Good night and good luck and all my best. Oh, and also, just before we stop recording and start recording our breaking news current affairs episode, I do have to say the following. Here at 1+1, we also want to say rest in peace and pay tribute to Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, actor Harris Yulin, George Wendt, who played NOORM on Cheers, and a very deep, heartfelt rest in peace and tribute to Sly Stone and Ananda Lewis, the now late superb MTV VJ during MTV's golden years during the 90s and early 2000s. And just want to say, Sly, thanks for giving us music that always wanted to take us higher, and for celebrating everyday people and denouncing the constant bigotry we humans stupidly subject ourselves to. And Ananda, you were an inspiration to Black kids like me, especially young ones, regardless of gender. I think voices and personalities like yours are going to be sorely missed in broadcast and radio music journalism. Here's hoping even that concept finds a huge comeback soon. You were criminally underused after your time at MTV, and you are sorely missed, and you were criminally underused after your time at MTV. So, you will be sorely missed then, and you are sorely missed now. Long live your positive legacy and that of Sly. And the others I mentioned, Circle X, mwah. So, good night and good luck until then, folks.